Now, how and why, during World War II, torpedo boats became motor gunboats? Pacific, Baltic, and Black Sea theatres. Now, you'll notice that it says the 5th of October here on there. And it's true. That's going to go live on the 5th of October. That's when the live is scheduled for, so I tend to put that as the date on the slides when it's for a live. But this is the recorded video, and I'm trying to get this done the day before, mainly because I need to get ahead on my other recordings. I'm currently not doing anything else other than recordings, so I should be theoretically getting ahead of them. Instead, I keep getting distracted by books. Really, trying to record in my space where I have all my books stored is not a sensible approach for me. I am a historian. This is bad. There are way too many tempting books around here. Including this one, of course, by D.K. Brown. Which, yeah. They're all here. Okay. So, how and why during World War II motor torpedo boats became motor gunboats? Well, you see, the Pacific, Baltic, and Black Sea theatres are slightly different. Whereas commando raids are the occasional, are a feature, not a bug, in terms of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean and their effect on how motor torpedo boats turn into gunboats. When we're talking about the Pacific, when we're talking about the Baltic, when we're talking about the Black Sea, it's not just the feature, it's the bread and butter. It's the entirety of their life. Very quickly, motor torpedo boats become... Well, they carry torpedoes, and if they do, it's as an extra assistance to their guns, just in case they come across anything which is actually big and nasty and need to beat it up. Most of the time, they're not even really fighting each other, they're fighting land targets. They're actually engaging and supporting troops. Some of the motor torpedo boats and the actions they get up to under the Americans are one thing, but the Japanese ones... And then we have the Russian. And that is the flow this video will take. We're going to look at the American, then we're going to look at the Japanese, and then we're going to look at the Russian. Because in many ways their experiences build upon each other. And in many ways, well, it wouldn't be fair to do them in any other way. I would also say I would like to park a couple of myths here. And when I say myths, I mean... Well, the trouble is with most myths, especially about historical myths, is they tend to take a small part of the reality of the history. They tend to take something which is, to an extent, true. And... they accelerate it. For example, I have been reading in a couple of places, even in a book, that all the Japanese torpedo boats were copies of German designs. Well, as we covered with the mid to late war Italian torpedo boat design, you can have something which is based in someone else's design, by a roundabout, circumspect route, and it can still be very, very different and its own thing. The problem with when you start saying something like all Japanese designs are based on German or something like that is A, you're ignoring their own design history, B, you're ignoring the realities of their own fabrication techniques they have that are available, and C, you're ignoring the realities of the design. And I'm not saying that the Japanese do not look to the Germans for some of their designs, and honestly that's a bit stupid. When you look at their needs, they should actually probably be looking at the British dog boats and going, yeah, that'll do for us. because mainly they're looking for something to try and kill the PT boats. And you sit there and go, yeah, the propaganda from the Germans is that the Schnellboats, what tend to be called E-boats in colloquial history, but all torpedo boats were E-boats, because E-boat literally stands for enemy boat. And I covered that in the first video. The propaganda for Schnellboats was they were all conquering. But the Japanese, for much of the war, managed to get both sides' propaganda. And we're actually quite good at still picking up. And even once they are at war with the British, etc. And, yeah, they went for the Schnellboat design, but they should have in many ways possibly tried to get hold of some Fermaldese designs. Maybe before war broke out. And especially as its wooden construction especially would have suited. And the wooden construction the British were doing for a lot of their torpedo boats would have suited the Japanese industrial base far more. Far more than what the Germans were trying to do with their Schnellboats. But this is the joys of history. And I've seen various people who've commented that recently. I keep returning to this theme of the problems with technology, and that it's not an easy drop across, and I should maybe do something about alternate histories, etc., and technologies, and of course technologies, how they build upon each other. And I can understand people the desire for that. But I see that as maybe something as a project to do next year, as a sort of retrospective looking back on the year of technology. So I can draw from all the videos, not just try and remember which ones haven't yet come out yet. Because the trouble is, my writing is far ahead of my recording, which is good, but does mean sometimes I'm probably saying things which have, and I'm referring to things which in my mind are done, but I haven't actually recorded or published yet. Joys of dyslexia and writing multiple projects. I shouldn't do it, but it's what I end up doing because I love the history. It's a bad habit I can't get out of. But the point I'm making is that nations can be at similar levels of technological development and can have very different, for want of a better phrase, tech trees and capabilities. And one of the things which I find most interesting about both America and Britain in World War II is that they seem far more able to draw from their wider tech tree than necessarily any of the other powers are. Russia clamps down its tech tree, it really does. And that's part of the reason they have the issues they have with the Cold War, and it's part of the reasons they have the issues almost today with their infrastructure industry, because of the way they clamp down. And you can understand the way they do, why they did clamp down, because basically Stalin doesn't like people innovating too much, because that might be a threat to him. And that's a problem with all dictatorships. It's nothing new for the Soviet Union, and it's nothing new for any others. But with the other nations, it comes about through different reasoning. With Germany, it's because the army has first dibs. The army always has first dibs. Then there's Goering's Luftwaffe, which has that advantage. And then finally comes the Navy, and because of, by the time they start to really have things under control, the focus is purely on churning out submarines, which, to be fair, aren't going to use a wider industry, because producing submarines, you're not going to get far with wooden submarines. Not in World War II. Not for what they want to do with them. The Italians, well, honestly, Educci just doesn't really work. when you go to the effort of leaving lights turned on so you look like you work later at night while you're out with one of your mistresses, you're going to a lot of effort to look like you're working. I mean, surely, it would have been easier just to leave the lights permanently turned on. Why turn them on for the night? Just leave them on the whole time. Saves on effort. Anyway, and then we have Japan. Japan is so worried about how they are perceived as being a modern nation, a great nation in their minds, and that is modern. They forget a lot of their capabilities they have. And where they use those capabilities, they don't really utilize them to their fullest, and we'll be getting into this. But it is an interesting scenario you're dealing with when it comes to motor torpedo boats, because really small boats, they are the critical point at which you should be going, should be pushing to use extraneous industries, to use industries outside of the normal utility for shipbuilding, because they're perfect for that, and because that takes the pressure off those core industries to allow them to focus on the larger ships, which you need them to focus on, and allow you to have others focus in on the small boats, which you do need focus on and are useful, but let's be honest, you're going to get over any problems with by a quantity scenario. Small boats are a quantity, not a quality scenario. When you turn small boats into a quality scenario over quantity, you are going to die every single time. Again, if we want to really get into this, it's a simple factor. Because you go, right, I've designed the best small boat, and it can do, let's say, 50 knots. It's amazing. It's got the ability to carry these 4 torpedoes, fine lines, super fine maneuvering. It can really maneuver. It's got 4 20mm cannon, all these things. Lovely. Great. Can do 40 knots, 50 knots, 50 knots. Yeah, good. What's the enemy got? Well, theirs can do a little over 30 knots, and, you know, they're slightly fatter, so which does make them more maneuverable, but they're not as fast, and, yeah. So, what's the ratio construction? Well, for my vessel, it takes months of high engineers to build. And theirs? Weeks. So they can field probably about 16 for the cost of one. So either they can be in 16 places when you can only be in 1, or they can have 2 of those boats in 8 places, or 4 of those boats in 4 places. And when you turn up, you're outnumbered and outgunned, and yes, you're going fast, but you've got to attack the target, which means you've got to get through them. They don't need high speed to chase you, you're coming to them. They just need enough speed to intercept you. It makes life different. It makes the reality different. Anyway, into what always comes next. Shameless book plug. Now, I'm a lucky guy. I always consider myself lucky. Because I might be having contract issues with the universities. I might be, trying to apply for permanent posts, but not seem to get through. And there's also problems in that recently quite some history departments have been shut down, and that means there are a lot of very experienced lecturers who are on the employment market. And so you look for a post which fits your research position, which fits your research standing, because that's how academics are selected, not on our lecturing ability, not on our anything else really, on our research standing. That's the thing that matters. because universities are rated on how well they get students to be able to talk and learn from world-class researchers and the best researchers. So research standing is what lecturers are, broadly speaking, rated on. And yes, lecturing ability is also looked into, but to be honest, and this could get me into mild trouble, if you ever wander around universities, you'll know very quickly which is the primary concern and which is the secondary concern out of the two. And universities here are delaying contracts due to, well, delaying some contracts due to, saving money. Can understand that. Things are tight. The university market is changing. Education is a market. Has been for many years. And yeah, it's interesting being a contract lecturer at the moment. But saying that, I have a book out, so I'm lucky. I've got others on the way if I can get the pictures right. And I've got the YouTube channel. I've got you, the listeners, the viewers, the subscribers, the members, and the patrons. That makes me lucky. That means I'm not so alone facing the naval history world. And yes, they still have the similar starting space, because World War I is where a lot of this stuff starts. There have been torpedo boats around for a while, okay? But those torpedo boats have developed into torpedo boat destroyers, and are now heading towards the destroyers. There are other torpedo boats, which are interesting vessels. And then there are motor torpedo boats. The difference is often several hundred tons. In that, a motor torpedo boat is often 20, 30 tons, if not less. Sometimes a little bit more, but if not less in World War I. They are giant killers. And the thing is, they could quickly become associated with the underdog. They could quickly be associated as the tool of the minor power, but the large powers embrace them. Britain embraces them. Why? Well, there's three main reasons. One, it's another method of using torpedoes to kill large targets, and let's be honest, that is a theme of World War I. Torpedoes killing large targets. Usually submarines, but killing large targets, but sometimes destroyers doing it. And the whole way through World War I, the torpedo is the big threat. It is the massive threat. If you look at Jutland, Jellicoe turns around not because he's afraid of battle cruisers charging at him. He could eat them for breakfast, lunch, and dinner with no trouble with the Grand Fleet. No, he's worried about a torpedo attack and the mathematical certainty that some of those will hit. If they launch enough torpedoes in his general direction, there is no way his ships can dodge them all. That is the reality of what he's talking about, of what he's dealing with. And that is the certainty of World War I. So, when we think about the development of motor torpedo boats in the run-up to World War II, when we think about the fact that a lot of nations jump back into these after seemingly ignoring them for many years, whereas some like Italy have kept them present, and some like Japan only actually really jump back into them after the war has begun, it's because of this legacy. It's because of the fear of the torpedo and the damage it can do. Because, as I've said on this channel many, many times, the way you sink a ship is, one, you start a fire that can't be controlled and can't be stopped, that drives people off the crew off the ship and destroys it from the inside out. Or two, you make a giant hole that lets water in it. Letting air into a ship does not sink it. Letting air in it is annoying, but it doesn't sink it. Letting water in sinks it. Starting a massive fire that burns out of control sinks it. Air? No ship has ever sunk from having too much air in it. It's always been the water displacing the air that's been the problem. And torpedoes, of course, automatically create holes that let water in. So, with that in mind, let's go to our American program. Oh, look. So, the US. They had this interesting sea sled idea, really, that you can sort of think about. Torpedo boat that was going around in World War I era. And it never really gets developed. It never really gets any effort put into it. And the few that do get created basically end up serving as rescue boats for the 20s and 30s. As a result, the US is sort of bereft. But still, they do purchase some British coastal motorboats, a 45-foot and a 55-foot one, in 1922-ish. And the 55-foot one is being used until 1930. And in 1938, they decide to actually put in some more designs to be developed. But interesting enough, they specifically exclude the sea sled, which had been devised by W. Albert Hickman. That always sounds sensible. We have a design which has been working for a long time, which we've ironed out many of the kinks of, but we're going to exclude it from our program. Now, in July 1938, the USN issued what's called a Notice of Competition. The request was for a design of 4 separate types of boats. A 165-footer subchaser, a 110-foot subchaser, a 70-foot motor torpedo boat, and a 54-foot motor torpedo boat. The plan was that the winning design proposals would each receive a prize of $15,000 and $1,500 for designs that reached the final part of the competition. The motor torpedo boat was not to exceed 80 foot and was to carry at least 2 21-inch torpedoes, 4 depth charges, and 2 50 cal machine guns. It was to achieve at least 40 knots with an operating radius of 275 miles at top speed and at least 550 miles at cruising speed. The boat, which was to be 54 feet, was to displace no more than 20 tons, so it would be easily transportable. And its maximum top speed was also to be 40 knots. But its radius was to be 120 miles at top speed and 240 miles at cruising speed. The smaller vessel was also supposed to be equipped with either 2 depth charges and 2 torpedoes and 2 depth charges, or a 50 cal machine gun and a smokescreen generator. By September, and remember they put this out in July, so July, August, September. The USN had received 24 proposals for the smaller vessel, 13 design proposals for the larger vessel, and of those, 3 of the 54-foot designs and 5 of the 70-foot designs were considered of interest. with those design teams being requested to submit more detailed plans no later than the 7th of November. That's nice. On the 21st of March 1939, Sparkman and Stevens won the prize for the 70-foot class, and George Crouch won the design proposal for the 54-foot class. Interestingly enough, George Crouch, who had won the design proposal for the small foot one, actually argued, after he'd won the design, that the sea sled, which the US Navy, remember, had, would be far superior. Far, far superior to any of the other designs available. Oh, it's always nice when people do that after they've won. At this point, with the designs issued, now contracts were placed for construction. Higgins Industries got requested to build 2 boats of the Sparkman and Stevens designs, scaled up, this is to a length of 81 feet. Fogel Boat Yard and Fisher Boat Works got to build 2 designs each of the Crouch design. 2 examples each of the Crouch design. And the Philadelphia Navy Yard got 2 of the 81-foot boats designed by the Bureau of Ships. It's nice, it's helpful, and I'm pausing a lot here. Why? Because at what point does any of this sound efficient or like a war's coming? I mean, it sounds like you've got all the time in the world. You're spreading the work around. It's a constant search for more and more pork barrels, it sounds like. You had a perfectly good design sitting there in use, and I will do a video at some point on the sea sled design. I don't want to touch on it too much today, but it really annoys me. Because, whilst, yes, I'm not going to claim it's perfect. But it would have been really easy to develop that. With the light of World War II coming in. And really quick. But no. With all these vessels built, including Higgins actually redesigned some of the vessels to his own specifications. It's always the joy of dealing with Higgins. They are put through rigorous testing. That's the phrase. And actually, it is rigorous testing. It's far more rigorous than probably was planned to be. At the same time as all this is going on, Elco, that's the electric launch company, and the designers of them, owner and designers, Henry R. Sutphen and Owen Chase, Bill Fleming and Glenville Tremaine, visit the UK in February 1939 at the USN's request to go and look at the British motor torpedo boats. They visit the British Powerboat Company. They purchase a very nice 70-footer MTB design from there, which they take back with them. This vessel had been designed by Hubert Scott Payne, who was a well-known powerboat racer at the time. And it would actually be this vessel, which would be renamed PT9, which would serve as the prototype for all the Elco PT boats. I think they purchased the design, but they also purchased some of the jigs and stuff which are used to help make it. So it's kind of, they're not purchasing the vessel itself from the UK, but they're purchasing not just the design, as I read it. Sometimes written as, they purchased the boat, they didn't purchase the boat. Sometimes it's read as, they purchased the design, they didn't just purchase the design. It's sort of, yeah, we've purchased the design, but we've also purchased some of the tools and some of the tooling you need to make this design to make it work with the systems you're planning on making it work with. And so this design comes in, and suddenly there's an extra design in the mix, and the USN asks Elco to build 11 copies of the PT9 after they play around with it and go, this is great. And on the 11th of October 1940, there's an agreement between the USN and Huckins Yacht Corporation. At this point, the Navy would provide the engines, and Huckins would build a PT boat at their own expense. This was a 72-foot boat, which became PT-69. To be fair, the whole requirement was that Hawkins would build a PT boat at their own expense. Navy provided the engine, and upon completion, it would be offered to the Navy for a later sum. They reported a profit of $28.60 on this transaction. He's not sure whether they were lying in that one, but I think it might have been the classic of releasing a few sprats to catch some mackerel. I.e., a lost leader, in more common phraseology and less Cornish phraseology. But still, this is what we have going on. And after this point, in March 1941, the USN starts conducting even more tests and organising even more work. And by July 1941, there's a Board of Inspection Survey being headed by Rear Admiral John Wilcox, conducting extensive tests. And they do open ocean trials, 2 of them. And these are the results for them. Which do make for interesting reading. You have the different designs. You also have the fact that very quickly one starts to realise that one of these vessels is very well equipped, but almost too overly equipped. But also interesting enough, the Higgins 81-foot demonstrates structural strength adequate, and so does the Navy Yard one. But those 2 vessels are by far and away the slowest vessels. So their structural strength is adequate because they put more of their weight into structural strength. Whereas the other 2 seem to have put their structure into speed. Honestly, looking at all of this, it's very interesting to try and work out which way they're going to go, because what you realise quite quickly is that none of these ships are out and out winners. None of them out and out win this. None of them are by and far away smoking the people behind them. They all have good points, they all have bad points. Which makes sense. But, and I do love this one, normally when we start talking about this, people go, well, you know, it's the LCS, which is the example of the US Navy hosting the competition and not actually declaring a winner, just going with both. Well, not necessarily quite. To be sure, that was it. Not necessarily sure. The recommendations they come up with, which are, I have to admit, some very cute recommendations, and they really are quite nice ones for them to have. The recommendations, and skip, yay, are this. And please note, I'm going to get them in a larger format so I can read them and be precise about them. There we go. That the Packard power plant having been found highly satisfactory, be adopted as standard for future construction. So all vessels are going to get the Packard power plant. That the honest installation of feeder motor boats consists of 2 torpedo tubes, machine guns, and depth charges. That the Huckins 78-foot PT-69 design be considered acceptable for immediate construction. That the Higgins 80-foot PT-6 design, suitably reduced in size to carry such ordnance loads as required by a Navy, be considered acceptable for immediate construction. That the Elco 77-foot design be considered acceptable for future construction, provided changes in lines are made to reduce the tendency to pound in a seaway, and the structure be strengthened in a manner acceptable to the Bureau of Ships. And that the Philadelphia 81-foot PT-8 be stripped of excess weight and be re-engined with 3 Packard engines. So, what happens from that? What is the result? Well, the result, unsurprisingly, is that pretty much all of the civilian yards, i.e. the vessels which, if we consider this, are cheapest, $206,600, $263,500, $302,100. The cost of all of them, interestingly enough, they're all the 3 which start getting produced, and the Navy Yard one doesn't seem to be pursued. Now, you can tout there as a giant win for the US Navy and for the taxpayer, and I do agree. Although I would say that if they hadn't tried to fit all the Navy fittings and various other things which they felt they were required to, it could have been substantially cheaper. And in many ways, their attempts to build it to Navy standards, rather than building it to the standards of the speedboat and adding on guns, is what does them in. And then we have the different speedboats, the different torpedo boats. The Elco 80-foot is really famous. It's a good little boat. It's a really capable little boat. But, and this is a point which is worthwhile considering, and this is not PT-109, this is PT-105. I can't find a picture of PT-109, which was, of course, John Kennedy's boat. But these vessels are 57 tons fully loaded. They are 80 foot, 24 meters overall length. They are really, really, really orientated for speed. But they're orientated for roughly 41 knots, 41 knots, with 4 torpedoes, 4 21-inch torpedoes, a 20mm cannon, some a pair of twin 0.5-inch Browning machine guns, 37mm, and a field modification mounted forward. If we go back to this lovely, lovely slide designed by me, you will see there is a little bit of a point. There is a space there for a 20mm cannon, probably, but yeah, something else gets fitted forward. Can't think why. And depth charges. Why? Why are they making field modifications? Well, for starters, they can make the field modifications. These ships are buoyant enough, they're designed to ride high enough that they can make the field modifications. But also, what are they running up against? Yeah, the torpedoes are a great weapon, but if you're running up against landing craft, if you're running up against small vessels, do you really justify using a torpedo? It's the whole problem with the surface raider dilemma. If you're using a main armament to sink merchant ships, it's incredibly inefficient. It's the same with submarines in this period and torpedoes. They don't carry that many torpedoes. They can't afford to use them all to sink merchant ships because they do, then they have nothing to sink warships which could be hunting them. And even then, they don't really want to sink all warships with torpedoes, because using torpedoes to take out Flower-class corvettes, well, honestly, you may hit. You may not. They're quite small targets in seaways, and they are quite manoeuvrable, and the Flower-class corvettes do weird things to avoid torpedoes in World War II. So you could waste a lot of torpedoes. Your deck gun will probably sink them anyway. But don't get into a deck gun fight with a Flower-class corvette. You'll find out it has more guns than you, and it was made to fight in the dirty top of the water. You weren't. Not as a U-boat. But in terms of the torpedo boats, the PT boats, what is the USN thinking about them? Well, they want to use them to aggressively press the enemy. They want to use them to aggressively support the Marines, to support the beach teams, to go around all these littorals. And there are so many islands and little islands. And even today, if you look at a map of the Pacific, even if you look at Google Maps, if you're looking over the ocean, very few of those little islands will show up until you start to zoom in. And zoom in, and as you zoom in, you see more and more islands, and you start to realise that the islands, which look like solid lumps, are actually themselves all fractured little bits. It's really interesting to look at, but this is the area where the Americans are sending these boats in. They're part of the island hopping campaign. They're part of the efforts to really push their forces forward. And these boats were good for that. They were really good for that. And they were very adaptable. Not perhaps the most adaptable, but definitely the most famous of the American vessels. The most adaptable is possibly the Higgins 78-footer, which, how do I put this politely, is basically deck space on a rather small hull. I mean, if we look at this vessel, you can see it's got, it's cabin space, it's got all the spaces in it. You don't look at this one and you're going, you've got a lot of deck space, and that deck space can be turned into things. A smart crew can really utilise that deck space. And then you consider the torpedo launching systems, and you're going, so those look like tubes. That looks like you just cast off your torpedoes. I mean, it doesn't not work for me. It works. It's a cool system. But yeah, talk about the bare minimum. Now, in the case of PT-658, which is one of the surviving examples, she actually never gets to sea service, and you see her in her final official form here. And that's what I find fun. She was going to be transferred under Lend-Lease to the USSR, but by the time she's finished, well, the war is over, and the Americans are worried about giving the Russians anything really this cool. And honestly, the Russians are getting their own. There was a great saga of her restoration. But she was armed with 4 22.5-inch Mark 13 torpedoes, a single Bofors 40mm autocannon, a single 37mm M4 cannon, 2 Oregon 20mm cannons, 2 twin 50 cal Browning machine guns, 2 Mark 6 420-pound depth charges, 2 Mark 50 rocket launchers, each with 8 cells, firing 5-inch Mark 7 spin-stabilized rockets, 1 60mm M2 mortar for target illumination, which was mounted on the bow, 2 30 cal Browning .3 30 cal Browning automatic rifles, 2 Thompson submachine guns, 2 M1 carbines, and a 35-gallon Mark 6 Tick-4 smoke generator. And that's the standard weapons fit. I mean, that's what they're coming out of the factory armed with, before the crew have even got to them. That's their baseline. And this is for a crew of 16, 2 officers and 14 enlisted. Had a top speed of 41 knots, 3 shafts, powered by some lovely 1,850 shaft horsepower Packard 5M S2 2,500 V12 engines, and yeah, could do 520 nautical miles at roughly 2,000 RPM and whatever speed that was getting you in headway. It's gorgeous. It's lovely. It's heavily armed to boot. I'm sort of going, you know, it's got rockets, it's got a mortar. Admittedly, that's an illumination mortar, but I'll give anyone a few minutes, and I'm sure 60mm mortar, that's going to be impossible to find anything for other than illumination rounds, isn't it? And, you know, I'm sure no one would fit any of these things with flamethrowers. And then we have the Huckins 78-foot PT boat. Ah, the Huckins. These are some cool little vessels. They really are. And they're fun. They are also possibly the weirdest story, in that whilst the USN orders happily roughly 400 Elco boats, deciding they are better than their competition, they drag their heels in ordering from the other winners, perhaps trying to pick out a winner. And when Huckins wins their design contract and gets their award, it's at the same time as in 1941 when the USN is planning to scrap the PT program. And let's be honest, this is the same service which decided that all other torpedo boat solutions which had been considered prior to 1940 were terrible and were defective. Admittedly, that was agreed by the Bureau of Ships, the Border Inspection Survey, and the Naval Personnel Command. 3 luminary bodies when it comes to some of the areas of ship design in the 1930s and 40s. They have moments of greatness. They also have moments of abject, "Oh my lord, what happened to you?" It's kind of like every organisation. Don't take this the wrong way. It's, you know... I pick up this book again. David D.K. Brown. My pet peeve of him is spends half his time in some of his books, especially World War II books. I've used some British phrases recently. Keeping the changing British and American phrases to wind people up. I used baseball bats for British admirals the other day, and I was basically referring to Beatty, who was the one going around, of course, who had an American wife, so he would have probably gone for a baseball bat, as well as a cricket bat, because he was hanging around with his in-laws. But, yeah, I can see why people said about cricket bats, but in the UK we don't really have a similar phraseology. We have backseat drivers, but that's not really it, and really you sort of want to talk about a Monday morning quarterback. You know, someone who, after the battle is over, refights. And because he was also involved in the naval construction, etc., you know, he likes to spend half his time making small digs about the other teams and how they weren't as good as the people he worked with, and how Stanley Goodall was understandably overworked, but, you know, he could have picked a better team for this mission or this task. You sit there and go, yeah, there is availability limitations, and also they're not necessarily a bad team. People can make silly mistakes. So, you know, you have to give them a bit of a benefit of the doubt, but there again, these are the same organisations involved in the Mark 14 torpedo, so maybe the benefit of the doubt doesn't go that far. It goes to a certain level. Anyway, The interesting thing about a Huckins boat is the quadraconic hull design. Now, this is a really cool method which Huckins have pushed forward. And what is really fun is that Huckins, because he believes in the nation, believes in supporting torpedo boats, actually grants permissions for Elko, Higgins, and the Philadelphia Navy Yard to all use the Huckins painted laminated keel, which increased hull strength, and was the reason why the Elko had pounded 60% more than the Huckins. And by the way, when we're talking about the pounding factor in the waves, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but what they did to work this out was they fitted them, and I kid you not, they fitted them with sensors to detect the pounding. Accelerometers were installed in the pilot house of each design to record what was happening to them. It's just, I'm not sure they standardized for the same pilots on each ship and how they approached waves, etc. Probably not. But yeah, and what's really interesting is when Huckins do come out, they considered high freeboard, good headroom below decks, and they equip 2 squadrons pretty much. So there are less of them put in than any of the others. But the Huckins vessels were considered to be comfortable by their captains and crews, and they're often referred to as yachts by the crews because that's what they felt like. These felt like they were the stars of the show. And they are really, really well designed. They had a top speed of 40 knots. They had armament of 421-inch torpedo tubes, capable of taking 4 of the Mark 8 torpedoes, or Mark 13s. They had a single 37mm or a Bofors 40mm dual-purpose cannon fitted on the forecastle, 20mm anti-aircraft cannon at the stern, 4.5 or 50 cals, as you can call them, in twin anti-aircraft mounts. They had 30 cal machine guns, mortar launchers, rocket projectors, and extra 20mm cannons, and 23mm anti-tank guns that were captured were also fitted, as available more than as required. There were 18 vessels built. And that saddens me, because these were really good vessels. Really good vessels. And as far as I know, I think they're still going. I looked them up online and I looked through the website, and I think it is the same company still going. I know they produce boats which have very similar lines to this. I am not sure if you can get a 78-footer, but they seem to have a fair number they offer in various designs, and frankly, they look good. They look really good. There is, I have to say, one which is the Hybrid Sportsman 38. Really appreciate that one. That is not history, I know, but I just thought, if you're interested, if you are looking at this series and it's inspiring you to get into having your own motor boat, there you can go and buy a Huckins, which, well, I would say the Hybrid Sportsman 38 looks very, very similar. I would say incredibly similar to the 78-foot PT boat. Although I think it is only 38 foot, possibly a little over 40 foot, so it's a little over half the length. Actually, a little under half the length. But still, very similar, very graceful lines. Worthwhile going and looking at, definitely. And you never know, they might build a 78-foot if you ask. They do custom orders. But I think that is, wow, the last of the specialist PT boats. But you see, it's worthwhile thinking other small vessels that end up fulfilling the same role, because of the US Navy really not pushing in for it as much as they necessarily could. They're always sort of, how do I put this? There seemed to be a lot of naval officers in the US Navy in the 1941-42 period who really don't like small vessels, and they seem to have all been shoved out the way into procurement positions. It's almost like someone's gone, I want to get rid of this guy, but I can't get rid of him. Where can I stick him? Where can I put him? And if you consider the example from Okinawa, what does this result in? Well, as this book will tell you, it results in landing craft infantry large being converted into landing craft infantry gun, armed with as many weapons as they can physically put on them, and sitting near beaches with the purpose of stopping Japanese suicide boats, for want of a better phraseology, from getting to the landing zones. Now that's a perfect role for motor torpedo boats. That's exactly what a motor gunboat should be doing. Intercepting and stopping them. And there are some there, but there are never enough. Someone asked me a while back when I was talking about dog boats in a lecture, and they were going, well, yeah, my I think it was grandfather was on them, and he was being deployed to the Far East at the end of the war with his boat. Why were they going out there? Why were they needed? And it's quite simply to assist in this role. Everyone was looking at what was happening in Okinawa. This entire book is made of the Admiralty's account of the operations on Okinawa. The British Admiralty's account of the operations. Their official. They're looking at what's going on and they're going, frigate, we're going to invade Japan? Frigate. We're going to need everything. And these are a great example of it. One of the things you notice the more you delve into the small boat realm is the more adaptability you find going on. And there is a lot of adaptability going on in terms of what they're prepared to offer. One of the things I find sad about these again is I don't think any of them survive. And I think that's a real shame. I would say this, not many landing craft survive at all. And again, it's the same for all small boats. Considering the hundreds that were built in World War II, thousands that were built of some of these classes, the fact that there are so few, if any, survivors, to me as a historian is distressing, but to me as a human who knows the value of seeing such things firsthand, of wandering around and being able to touch, stand close to it, look at it, feel its presence in a way, and how that impacts you in terms of your knowledge and understanding of what happened. That's a loss. And these were great vessels. Some of them were actually lost in combat, fighting against those small boats. But more often than not, they stopped the small boats. When they were trying to thread along the shore, too shallow for destroyers and other vessels to interfere with, these were what would shred them. That was their job, and they were good at it. Now into the IGN, and let's start off with, first of all, for the IGN, for most of the period we're talking about in the 1920s and 30s, their idea of a torpedo boat is the Chidori or Otori class, which are what they're building. These are the vessels which have issues. The Chidori class, which is the top right picture, as you're looking at so, This one? This one. Are found after Tomozuru incident, which almost caused the loss of Shidori herself, as well, to be woefully top-heavy and absurdly lightly framed. The Otoria class are actually under construction at this point, and they then have to do some rapid reworking on them, but they also do some rapid reworking on the Shidoris. And the whole idea had been to try and produce something which would be a force multiplication asset for the destroyers, but also would fill in all the gaps. And you can say that the problems the Japanese have in World War II with their number of escorts and their preparation in terms of their small vessels come down to the failure of this torpedo boat line. Principally, they were trying to keep going the torpedo boat or the torpedo boat destroyer era, and they're trying to keep them working, and they're probably looking at the Italians and going, well, they're managing it, but the Italians are managing it in the Mediterranean. The Japanese are in the Pacific. And whilst the Pacific is not the North or South Atlantic, most of the time, the Pacific is also an ocean. And the Pacific has certain standards. It demands a certain level of respect. It might be a kinder soul than the Arctic and the Atlantic, but it still demands a level of respect, and frankly, these do not respect it. They were lightly enough built that when the Pacific did decide to say, look, you have to respect me, sadly enough, people lost their lives. And this then caused a problem for the Japanese in that they start to get very worried about smaller vessels. In some ways, they start to cheat even more. They start to even more wink and shamelessly ignore the naval treaties. But in others, they start to really sort of think, okay, we've got to build bigger in order to be able to build big enough to do what we want to do. Building a smaller, you can't build a smaller vessel up to be bigger as easily as you can build up a bigger vessel to be bigger, i.e. to fight a level above, because these are supposed to be able to fight destroyers while being torpedo boats. They couldn't. The idea was to build up. You can more easily build a cruiser that can maybe take on a battleship. If it can spam it with torpedoes at long range, it can take on anything. Especially if the battleship doesn't know it's there. Night torpedo attack. It's almost going to be... World War II would have been so interesting if the Japanese and the British had a night battle in roughly equivalent strengths. Because the British night doctrine is to get as close as possible, i.e. to see the white of their eyes, approach them with your guns pointing on them, and only when they start to move their own guns, open fire. And the Japanese is to try and do torpedo spam at night. So one is to stand off and lob torpedoes at your enemy, as hopefully they're acting in a particular way you can fire torpedoes at them in range. And the other one is to close. And you can work out which way it goes, but basically if the British are behaving dumb and not zigzagging and not monitoring their radars, etc., then the Japanese can rightly damage them. But if the British are monitoring their radars and are zigzagging, which makes long-range torpedo attacks very difficult to predict and aim, well, then the British could end up getting very close. And it's also going to depend if the British spot the Japanese first, thanks to radar, at range, and know where the Japanese are better than the Japanese know where they are, then it can get really nasty, because the problem with having vessels which are built up to try and take on the vessels above them, normally what you do is you sacrifice armor, staying power, so you can maximize firepower. Because the idea is you can't win a long fight with your opponent, but if you can overwhelm them quickly, you can take them down. Again, if we think about it in the level of humans engaging other humans. If someone smaller is fighting someone bigger, their advantage has to be they have to either wear out their opponent or they have to take them down quickly. Because if you are fighting someone in a space which is in many ways confined, even as large as it can be, the bigger person should tire more quickly running around chasing you. in theory. Depends on level of fitness, of course. But if you're considering otherwise equal, but if they get close, you're gone. And if you give them any time, they will win in actual engagement. If the engagement goes on anything longer than the initial seconds, you're in trouble as a smaller person. It's exactly what ships which are built to fight up are built with the idea of. They always have to overwhelm their opponent quickly. They have to get maximum number of shells on them. They have to get maximum number of targets. And if you think about any Navy which is doing, including the British, okay, good example, Town-class cruisers, the British Light Cruiser program. Why are they going for 6-inch guns rather than 8-inch guns? Because of the rapid firing. Or 6-inch guns in rate of fire compared to the 8-inch guns. And the sheer volume of shells they can put down on target. And the knowledge that those shells will cause just as much damage to a heavily armoured ship as probably the 8-inch shells will. But to an unarmoured ship, they'll put it down more quickly because they'll score more hits and more likely to hitting something vital and probably going to do just as much damage to a virtually unarmoured ship as an 8-inch shell is. 8-inch shell will possibly cause more individual damage, but the 6-inch shells will cause more cumulative damage because of the rate of hits if you've got a volume of fire. But also, if you're fighting something larger, i.e. like Scharnhorst at the Battle of North Cape, you deluge it in 6-inch fire, you blind it. You damage it. You stop it being able to fight back at you with volume of fire. That's how you fight up. And all navies are thinking about this. Some are more blatant than others, but all navies are to an extent thinking about this. But that is not to say that the Japanese do not do the whole torpedo boat thing. In fact, they have 451 more conventional motorboats during World War II. They're an interesting range, though. They are really an interesting range. What is most interesting about these vessels is they... How do I put this politely? The classes keep growing to an extent. The classes keep going up in size as the Japanese seek to do more and more with them. And you end up with, of course, the famous Type 51s, roughly 36 of them, which are, and I want to be honest about this, and I know I made a point about this at the beginning, but I'm going to say this again, based on a Japanese interpretation of the Schnellboot. Now, here is the thing. The Type 51's development progress is... oh, good lord. How do one put this? Intriguing! Intriguing indeed. Basically, you might have heard sometimes the phrase, it's as if they try to copy the design thanks to, and this is not Type 51, 51 the picture of, they tried to copy the design from a fax of it. Well, literally, that's what they did. They had a civilian motorboat that had been built by Lursen, who had a builder of Schnell boats, owned by the Mitsui family, and they had a sketch. And so they started building what's called the number 600 prototype. And it's laid down in July 1942. It's completed in November 1943. So just think about that. It's taken over a year to build it. And, well, half that mass production never really gets to take place because they're just testing the prototype. And then the Japanese receive actually a detailed designer's drawing of the 95-foot Schnellboot. However, there's a small problem. The Japanese do not have the same experience producing the type of boat and type of hull which the Schnellboot had been produced for. And, well, due to the fact the Schnellboot is, now some would say, a finely crafted design. Others would probably look at it and go, you've over-engineered what you need for the job. You need something that's easy to mass produce and going to be do 90%. You don't need perfection. But the Schnellboot was perfection. And as with all perfect designs, there were issues when you're the Japanese and you don't have that design and technological heritage to build from. You have your own design and technological heritage. So you start to simplify the design down to fit your materials and your parts. And that causes problems, which mean you then have to adjust things to... Some would use the phrase mitigate, others might say compensate, others still might say trying to ignore the problems that tends to create. And this created issues with vessel stability. It's fun times. Hello. Wasp came in, Wasp went out. I would love to say this is not a good example of quite a lot of the Japanese boats. But when you start to look at the run of these boats, they keep changing. At no point, they've got 81 boats, 39 boats, 23 boats, 6 boats, 33 boats, 8 boats, 6 boats, 15 boats, 55 boats, 44 boats, 1 boat, 80 boats. Pretty good. It's the highest number we've heard so far. I'm hoping I typed it in right. 8 boats, and then 36 boats for 51s. And that's pretty much also going up in size. To an extent. There are... It's basically... And when I say it's going up in size, it's if you put them on a graph, you'd have outliers. But it's, broadly speaking, doing that. On a line of best fit. And... the problem for the Japanese is mass production. I have made the comment in the past on Italian battleships, and in many ways, much of the Italian Navy in the interwar years of World War II being kind of like their supercar production line. They produce amazingly beautiful and very, very technologically interesting ships. But they don't exactly design them to be easy to manufacture or, how do I put this politely? Able to be quickly manufactured or quickly repaired. Every single thing is a work of art. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You get a very fine product to the end, like all supercars. They are very fine products. They are something you will be rightly proud to own. But at the same time, they're also the things that when you take them to the garage, it requires a mortgage of your house to pay the bill. So, it's the same problem the Japanese have with the torpedo boats, or the motorboats. But theirs comes from a different angle. They keep changing their minds. Every time they get something to the point at which you could theoretically have turned into a mass-produced thing, they go on to something else. And honestly, the Type 51 is the best example of that being a silly, silly thing to do. Because the Type 14 here is a perfectly decent boat. There are 81 of those produced. It's got depth charge racks, it's got torpedoes, and it's got guns. It's fairly stable, it's fairly workable. In any other navy in the world, other than the Japanese and probably, well, even the Italians on their motorboats, they do concentrate in on them. So maybe the Italians would, and the Germans did. Everyone else would have gone, right, then we've got this. Let's start building as many of them as we can physically build. Let's start building iterations on these. Let's build these. And they don't. That's the point at which you should have taken that design around to all the small yards that could produce them and gone, build. There aren't many small yards in Japan, not as many as there are in Britain and America. A wasp keeps coming in here and going out. Gonna have to have a conversation with that in a second. But there are enough. They could have started producing large numbers of them. And the good thing about the Type 14 is it's entirely fitting within the Japanese design development technology tree. But they're chasing other ideas. They're chasing the promise of others. And yes, the Type 14 is a 50-foot boat. They weigh in at 15 tons. They have a top speed of 33 knots and armed with a 25mm cannon and 2 of the 18-inch torpedoes. You can sit there and go, well, Alex, actually, that's not going to match in, The PT boat's 70 foot, 80-foot vessels. So scale it up. Take the existing design you've got that works, you're building 80 vessels of, and scale it up. That's a complicated thing. You can look at various examples of boats and ships around the world. Scaling things is not necessarily easy, but it's far better to start from a tech tree you are firm on than to try with a tech tree you have no starting point on. And that's the problem. What they do instead to scale up, they go for the Type 51. And they barely produce any of them. 36. I think the wasp has now settled down, so I will have to do some wasp removal in a second. But let's talk about the Shinyo. This is the other area of interesting thing for torpedo boats in the Pacific War. In that, at a certain point, the Japanese start to get ideas about how to use certain vessels. The Kamikaze Divine Wind from the air and the Shinyo Seaquake and all the other systems they had are a sign of desperation. That's often what's believed as. But also it's a sign of their perception of the weakness of Western powers. They believe mounting casualties will cause them to withdraw, to give in. They believe that by causing endless, pointless death, they will force them to either pause, offer terms, or maybe even withdraw. What's interesting, perhaps, for Japan is the two scenarios they are faced with. They don't seem to understand this, but they probably could work this one out. Those two scenarios are very nasty options for them. The options, of course, are invasion or blockade. That's what the two big powers' sort of policies towards them are. The British, to an extent, pre-war planning and a lot of their wartime ideas are towards, frankly, let's just blockade and watch them die. The British are not always the nicest people to fight. In fact, they're never the nicest people to fight. They are fundamentally not the idea of charging in and getting themselves killed when they can just let your own food supplies do it for you. Or rather for them. But the Americans wanted to end the war. So the Americans were looking at an invasion. They didn't think necessarily that a blockade would do what it needed to do. And I can understand the American perspective. If you want regime change, if you want to avoid this flaring up and becoming a problem again, and when you're dealing with a nation state, they have resources. Nation states have resources at a level which other actors just don't. For all the power, and we often talk about this in modern international relations theories, for all the power of the massive corporations, etc., the multinationals. And they surely do have the power to cause trouble for smaller states. But if it really became a test of wills between them and the nation states, the largest, most powerful nation states, they would quickly find themselves in a world of trouble. Because economic power is one thing, but having economic power, the rule of law, and the right to use force tends to trump all the others. And at best, you can hope for divided loyalties as a company. After all, the days of the company person who basically lives and dies with the company is over. Everyone's hunting for just for a paycheck these days. The thing is about nation states is they can often command far more support thanks to cultural and, well, heritage reasons. And that's, to an extent, what Japan was banking on, what the Japanese government was banking on when they're using systems like this. They're using their cultural heritage. They're using the strength of their population and their national identity and mobilizing that as a tool. But still, these are weapons of desperation. They really are. And now we get on to the Soviet Navy. Oh my. We did spend a lot of time on the Americans, and I do admit that was partially because the Americans had such a long and massive development program. And basically throughout all of their technology development. But we're now starting onto the Soviets. Now, whereas the Japanese continually change their minds, the Soviets, I'm not sure how I can really put it more than they are a nation when it comes to torpedo boats of great momentum, if not necessarily great thought. And when it comes to developing them into gunboats, it kind of already happened. But I still love the fact that in World War II, they were using an A-class vessel of the Kaiserlich Marine from World War I, because it had been raised and repaired in 1923 to serve in the Estonian Navy. Then when Russia took over Estonia in October 1940, they renamed it the Amethyst, and it would serve the whole way through World War II until scrapped in 1950. Think about that. One of the vessels beating up the German Navy at certain points in World War II was one of their own World War I torpedo boats. One of their own World War I torpedo boats. Fun. But let's get on to the Soviet motor torpedo boats. And unfortunately, we should really go all the way back to the beginning, because there is a vessel at the beginning which they owe their origins to. Yes, the coastal motorboat. There are some very strange ideas in the coastal motorboat's design. Some of the options looked at were frankly absurd. And some of the how do I put this politely? Well, if you have ever gone and seen the version which is at the Imperial War Museum in Duxford, you will notice that the torpedo launch system is a little bit strange, as we understand it, because the torpedo doesn't go off the front. Well, I can only say that the Soviets saw this idea. They saw this, and they thought, that's a good idea! Okay, not sure how everyone else managed to get round to the idea of going, actually, hang on, if we drop them off the stern, then they ignite, we have to be far more careful about how we're diving off and which angles we're going at, because otherwise our own torpedo boats will run into our own torpedoes. So we don't want to do this. But the Soviets went, but it means they can launch in really sort of in rough seas, and we can do this. It's just not a good idea. Please don't. It's just not a good idea. Yes, it works, but the sheer amount of complexity it brings with it when it works does not make it better. But if you're looking at this vessel and you're thinking, Alex, that looks like someone's put a submarine conning tower on a slightly semi-planing hull with torpedoes coming out the rear that will then go forwards. Was someone on a lot of very good vodka when they were designing this? Or was it not much, but very cheap vodka? And I would say it's actually disturbingly effective. I mean, it's almost 11 tons. It has... We're not quite sure the shaft horsepower. We do know it was roughly 1,000 brake horsepower on the motors. Usually vessels are given in shaft horsepower. There was an interesting discussion in a previous live about some motor torpedo boats having been given brake horsepower or conventional horsepower, and yes, there were all sorts of interesting discussions. But the Soviets go their own way. The Allies mostly end up with the shaft horsepower by the end, because that's how navies think about engines. That's the thing. You might be thinking, well, hang on, this is a motor. It's the same motor which is used in tanks. It's used in aircraft. And it's used. Yeah, they sure them. No, navies think in terms of shaft horsepower. I mean, it's like the whole whether it gets a name or a number thing. It's the traditions, and trying to get them out of that tradition is very difficult. But also, for a navy, shaft horsepower makes sense. It's kind of like also why some of the distances and equations are given. It can manage this many revolutions for this long. And what speed does that make? Well, whatever that many revolutions creates. Okay. And if you've ever noticed, there aren't actually speed sometimes on some ships, and if you go from, they have rough revolutions to a rough speed, because if you're especially going into a heavy current, your maximum revolutions might normally give you a forward movement of, let's say, 30 knots. But if you've got a 6-knot current against you and a 2-knot headwind, you may be doing something closer to 25, if not 23. Depending on where you are on the waves. Life can be fun. So, we have the SH-4. And honestly, this is the first proper series of motor torpedo boats from them. The I don't really know how to describe this, but between 1925 and 1928, they developed the SH-4. And I've put it down as 1925, but most of the specs we have come from its 1928 version. And we do realise that it managed to put on roughly, it went from 10.8 tons to 10.9 tons in standard in those 3 years of evolution before it was mass production. They carried two 18-inch torpedoes, as you can see. And they had a lovely machine gun. They were very stable in heavy weather, you have to admit that, and the conning tower observation deck and all the other things managed to mean that it was a very useful vessel for rough seas. So you can justify it from the Soviet perspective. And the advantage of having the torpedoes in what's called a cradle system, please note it's called a cradle system. I wanted to explain all before I started calling it a cradle system, because frankly, that means you're launching babies to me, and that just seems wrong. Okay, I know cradle is used for many things to describe many things other than just what you put babies in it, but once you're dealing with torpedoes and the various euphemisms that go around navies for torpedoes, the fact that you are storing them in stern cradles, and they actually, in some phrases, are describing it as berthing the torpedoes from the cradle, I get really worried about what the Soviets might have been calling their torpedoes at certain points. Okay, I get really worried about it. When you read a phrase which has been translated, I have to admit, I checked the Russian myself a little bit. I'm not 100% fluent in Russian or anything like that. I'm engineering Russian I can do, but I checked the phraseology, and I agree, broadly speaking, with the translation, which is berthing the torpedoes from their cradle. That worries me, okay? That worries me. We'll leave that to one side. Originally, they ordered 36 in the production version of 26, 1926. They ordered an extra 16 in 1932. They kept ordering a few more. There are roughly 55 in service by about 1937, split between the Baltic, the Black Sea, and the Pacific. By the end of the 1930s, most had been reclassed as sub-chasers. The reason the original ones most have been reclassed as sub-chasers is because there has been absolutely atrocious maintenance of them. But don't worry! Don't worry! Just because, just because we've been terrible with this one, we're going to jump into this one. And if you're going, hang on, Alex, the first one was called the SH-4. Okay, that's not. Now it's on to the G5. Please understand one thing. The Soviet naming and designation of some of these systems, it's very, very political, and sometimes you will have collaborations between design teams and and factions. And the one which you actually, when you look at the vessel and you go, well, that looks very much like that design legacy, but it's given the designation of another design legacy. Why? Well, the answer is one did all the work, but one had far more political clout, so they got the designation, so they officially get the contract and the honor. But I'm sure they can find a way of passing on any blame for any problems to the others. And yes, again, Birthing torpedoes from the cradle. Hey, just... They are described as single-step hydroplaning design with a whale-back upper hull. Built from duralumin, which is, if I'm not mistaken, it's an aluminium copper alloy, and it's considered very, very useful. It's also one of the earliest ones and had originally been developed in Germany in 1909. So the fact that it is the material being chosen by the Soviets to build their torpedo boats from in the 1930s is intriguing. But it's copper and aluminium, so, you know, it's strong. But it's not that strong. There are actual reports, and the Germans had a complete file on these ships. And pretty much, according to one of the sources, a captured Soviet torpedo boat officer. They always list him as a commander, but he could have just been any officer. They seem to get confused with some of the Soviet boat ranks, and also I wouldn't be surprised if some officers, when they're captured, play up their ranks to try and get better treatment. Because it was quite well known amongst the Soviets that the Germans treated regular soldiers pretty much worse than they treated anyone. The officers weren't treated much better, but they got slightly better treatment. And according to that account, the G5s can only be kept in the water for roughly a week during the summer, and 2 weeks during the winter before they had to be removed from the water and treated with anti-corrosion measures. I would say, from a duralumin hull, a copper aluminium hybrid in salt water. If some of you are starting to think that I'm talking about the literal combat ship, I'm not. I'm talking about another government which managed to forget all about the joys of galvanic corrosion. And yes, sacrificial anodes. Ay, caramba. But the hull's divided into 3 compartments by 2 transverse bulkheads. And, you know, it has space. It's quite a nicely designed hull. And they could do, theoretically, 53 knots! In a vessel which displaced roughly 16 1/3 tons standard, officially. And they could do that with roughly 1,700 brake horsepower, crew of 6 to 7, and they're armed with 2 12.7mm, that's 0.5-inch machine guns, and 2 21-inch torpedoes in the cradle. I will say this, there are several variants of them, and they are, broadly speaking, produced in Series 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Now, the Series 11 use 1,000 brake horsepower engines and could get to 56 knots. The Series 7, which are the ones which start off between 1934 and 1936, they displaced 14 tons at standard load and could only really carry 1 machine gun. So the figures I gave you roughly were for the the middle series vessels. The thing is, there's 152 vessels of roughly equal thirds of the Series 7, 8, and 9 produced. And then built between 1934 and 36. 20 of the Series 10 boats are built in 1937, and 76 between 1938 and 39, making them probably the most common variant when you have another fire produced between 1939 and 40. You have to sort of add that all up, and you quickly get to about 101 of them out of the roughly 300 G5s which were built. And then Series 11 boats, which are the last series, start building in 1941. And here is where things get interesting, because production potentially continued during the war and probably did continue. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, there were at least 254 G5s in service. And one of the interesting things about these were that they were quite well maintained. It's one of the interesting points. The previous class, the SH4s, had trouble because of maintenance. The G5s do get maintained, and you always wonder if it is an advantage of that hull. That hull forces them to take them out of the water, otherwise they sink. So the crews are very committed to maintenance, because otherwise they will die. And that tends to motivate them. They provide quite a lot of people who do maintenance. And if you're taking the vessel out of the water, you do other things while you're at it anyway. So that actually keeps them to quite a high level of capability. They are used for so many different duties during World War II. They did pretty much very few torpedo attacks. They did manage to sink a Finnish mine layer. They managed to sink some German minesweepers. They did all sorts of things like that. And then several of them were sunk as well. But more of the whole as they get used as for landing troops. Yes, troops literally crouched in the torpedo cradles and jumped off. Occasionally they put boats in there as well. They were used as rapid transports, moving sometimes high-value personnel around. Hello, you're back again. Sorry, Wasp has returned. Could you mind? Doodles, please. No, we want to sniff my bag. I don't want to kill you because you're a wasp, and I'm actually quite nice. I try to be nice to wasps and bees, and even all the other yellow and black things. Go on, out the door. Out the door. Thank you. No, out the door, please. Thank you very much. Sorry about that interlude. They were used for all sorts of things, and they're really good at it. But despite them being used more and more for supporting troops, officially they don't get any gun upgrades. Unofficially, their crews could be quite interestingly kleptomaniac. And I can understand that. But there aren't many of them, and there isn't much space on that vessel. And let's be honest, in the joy of a whaleback design means, whilst you do have deck space, it also means you're going to get a lot of water over that deck. So try and keep something going up there is interesting. And then we have the D3. Now, this is a wooden motorboat and torpedo boat, and if you're going, Alex, is that the Torpedo? I would go, yes, it is! It's amazing. In roughly 1935, the Soviet Navy suddenly thought, hang on, maybe all our torpedo boats are a little bit small. Or, I'm not sure who suddenly realised they were small. There are no big British ones wandering around, or even Japanese or Italian ones wandering around at this point. The only person who really has larger motorboats wandering around at this point are Germans. So I'm presuming, finally, someone has told Comrade Stalin about the Schnellboot and the Ramboot. And Comrade Stalin gone, oh, we cannot be smaller than the Nazis. I have no basis of that, but that would fit with the timeline. And by 1937, it's such a quick process when it's motor torpedo boats. I mean, if you consider the pace of development of the British and even of the Italians and the Germans and the development of things, and then you've got the Americans with their ongoing long-term program, which must ignore everything they've done before because that would be sensible to look at that, and you've got the Japanese who, I'm not sure what they're on with their program. And the Italians who just going, yes, we like our mass boats, and then eventually go, you know what, these are not big enough, we need something bigger. And then you still have the Soviets, who have an ongoing program and yet still take forever to design a motor torpedo boat. Absolutely forever. So, they create two designs. What are called the D2, which is made of wood, and the steel SM3. So the wooden one is called the D2, and the steel one is called the SM3. The SM3 decided to have its hull crack at high speeds. Not surprising, really. Wood is the equivalent of fiberglass in this period, and if you want something that's going to turn up to the constant movement and pounding of high-speed planing hull, you ain't really going to get many steels at this point designed to that level. But D2 had poor stability. Both were commissioned into the Black Sea Fleet, but neither entered production. Thank the Lord, and aren't the Black Sea Fleet happy, you know. So both these are terrible, and you're giving them to us anyway. Yes, Commissar. And what is your plan for us to use them as? We can't just use them as a source of firewood and, I don't know, whatever we can use the steel for. No? We have to actually have them ready for parades. Oh, great. Warrant officer, yes. Send me the two lieutenants who I hate the most. Now. I have a command for them. I'm not saying that's how the process went down of finding out who was going to be put in charge of them, but I wouldn't be surprised. So basically, they then took the D2 and they worked on it. They worked on it a lot. And, well, they decided to develop the D3 from it. The prototype was completed in 1939, and production was ordered before trials of the prototype had even begun. I just love it. We are so confident in our ability not to produce a terrible design, we're going to start ordering the production now before we even tested the new thing we've just built. Really? So the previous tests were great. No, one was so bad we would never produce from it because it had stability issues. And the other one, well, its hull was cracking in half. So you sure you want to order this design off the paper? Yes, because we're confident. In what? They were designed to have three what are known as Michelin GAM 34FN engines, driving three shafts, but those engines were so unreliable that even the Soviet Union had to admit they didn't work. That's something. Getting the Soviet Union to admit an engine as anything doesn't work is an amazing feat. And they were discontinued in 1940, which meant they got the less powerful GAM 34BS engines. And I know you're thinking, what does the BS stand for? Well, I'm not saying it out loud. Build ship, I'm sure. Build ship. Anyway, this drop in horsepower led to a drop in speed from 48 to 32 knots. They were armed with two heavy machine guns of the collectively termed various types, but what we would also term as, basically, despite the fact that we are only building roughly 73 of these vessels, so not really that many, we couldn't actually manage to organise ourselves under the strain of war to even standardise for 73 vessels. Oh, and by the way, we weren't even in war when they started being built, so we could have stockpiled and put the weapons to one side, but we weren't that organised. Thankfully, there were crews who would often look at the machine guns and go, "Where is the nearest 20mm Oricon? Please? 20mm Oricon? We want something that's serviceable and works." I think someone might be chopping a tree down in the background. Anyway, they displace 31 tons. And their length is 22.4 meters. That's 73 foot overall. Yeah. Now, one of the things it's worthwhile noticing is that these vessels had variants, in that there was the wooden sub-chaser torpedo boat originally, then the steel sub-chaser, cancelled, and then the wooden torpedo boat, known as the TD-200 BIS of the D3 type. NATO decided to call it P2, which used then lease ones, and then they decided to build also a steel variant of the wooden ship, which they produced 24 of. I just have no words. No words. Oh, by the way, the steel ships, steel versions, had just the same problems as their predecessor. I'm not sure whether you have to admire the Soviets for their sheer unwillingness to give in on anything, or whether you have to think, my, you are the people who honestly could, through inertia alone, end up running headfirst into a brick wall you see down the opposite end of the street from you when you start running. I have no words. But again, the crews keep adapting these vessels because they can adapt them and they actually can displace more. Consider these standard official displacement figures, 31 tons, in standard, are out compared to their actual tonnage, and thankfully the wooden ones were especially quite buoyant. And I don't know how, considering their inauspicious start, but the wooden D3 ones actually turned out to be quite decent. I mean, God love them, but they had faith and they were proven correct. It worked. So most of this is the crews adding on, and the crews really did add on. And then we have the P4. Now, if you're looking at this torpedo boat and you're going, Alex, I've seen that shape before somewhere, you would not be wrong. But officially, that shape was entirely Soviet in origin. I mean, there is nothing in that shape which reminds you of any of the Vosper boats at all. I mean, your accusations that it looks like a complete and utter rip-off of a Vosper design and fits with when the Soviets went toward the Vosper factory, Vosper yard factory where they put their boats together, is completely wrong. I completely refute that allegation. At no point has anyone said, compare this to a Vosper. But I would say maybe there is an homage going on to some lines somewhere. But also, of course, there's the Soviet development. And again, it's built of Duralum. It's just lovely. They gave them American-supplied Packard petrol engines instead of the Michelin GAM 34s, which is not a bad thing. They were armed with 2 twin machine guns. That's 12.7mm heavy machine guns, and 2 450mm 18-inch torpedo tubes, and 6 depth charges. They stayed in service for a long, long time, and this one is actually pictured here is a decommissioned vessel that's with that will serve the Bangladeshi Navy and is preserved at the Bangladesh Military Museum. So if ever I visit India, definitely going to visit that and have a look at it. They produced a few variants again. The Project 123K, also known as the standard P4, actually gained radar, which was helpful. And they would serve in World War II, they would serve after World War II, they'd be taking part in fights in the Taiwan Straits for many years. And this one, of course, Bangladesh. But they did serve in World War II, and it was right at the end. They were delivered to the Baltic Fleet in 1944. And it was in April 1945 that TK-131 and TK-141 managed to score hits against the Z-34, a German destroyer. That's a Type 1936A Zerstörer. Though they didn't manage to sink it. There have even been post-World War II where Egyptian versions were fitted with rocket launchers, and one of them was captured by Israel. But well, what was all that about? That was an introduction to the joy that is the world's messiest topic. No, I kid on the world's messiest topic. But I would say you have small boats in all these wars, and in many ways they are used by people who don't understand them. Please don't, before you start jumping down my throat, let me explain. There are literally no senior officers who've come from small boats in command. If we consider the two closest in Britain are Twitt and Keyes, both very senior admirals, very important people. But yeah, where are they when it comes to torpedo boats? And yes, the officer will go, oh, we have small boat handling experience. We handled boats when we were, young in ships. That's not the same as coordinating and figuring out boat tactics and small boat tactics. It's not the same as using a destroyer. Not the same. We're talking about vessels which have tonnage under a score. Maybe maximum 2 score of tons. It's a different world. And yes, you have some navies which do have these vessels in peacetime, but again, you look at how the officers are treated, where they get to, what their ranks are. There are some who do well. But look at where they are in 1945, in 1939, and look at what they become. This is what makes it so interesting to me when we see the designs being put through. When you look at things like the American program, and the reason I spent so much time on the American program, because it's just so intriguing that you have these people who are so confidently making assessments of the vessels, and you look at them and go, but you have never operated such a vessel. One of the things that happens a lot during World War II is that a lot of crews, especially in the ones that have been the topic of this video, find themselves inventing their doctrine, their operational methodology, everything as they go. That's why you end up with people, for want of a better phrase, like John F. Kennedy involved. Because he fits that sort of personality profile. He doesn't really like being under command of anyone else. And he doesn't really fit, therefore, in a larger ship. For all your politics of him, leave that to one side. Think of that as a personality. As an individual leader. And there is also a very different leadership style in terms of small team leadership, small unit leadership, than large formation leadership. Because you are an officer, yes, but you're an officer in charge of enough people that, frankly, they could they could go into most restaurants without a warning and get a table. And you're not having to deal with anyone else. There's no one else there for you to talk to. It's not like when you're a department head on a ship. There's other department heads for you to go and talk to. This is your team. This is everything in one go, in one group. And you've got to get them through a war. And you're in vessels which things are being asked of you which you can do on paper, but no one has done anything like in a long, long time, and no one really remembers or has talked to the people who did it then to ask them how they did. And that is an issue. Good boats, though. I find it interesting when I look at some of the work put into their design and some designs. You can argue that some of the similarities that come about are looking at similar profiles for similar problems. That you have a similar problem, so you come up with a similar solution. And this is a factor in humanity. Honestly, this is a factor in humanity. When people try to do things like who discovered the wheel first and who discovered this or that first, you sit there and look at them and go, it depends. It depends a lot on what was going on, but also, in terms of wheel, at what point do we consider a log which has been cut, a tree which has been felled and maybe cut up to be a wheel? You probably don't. But at a certain point, it looks kind of wheel-like. It's the same with motor torpedo boats. You have a lot of people scrambling for to deal with an issue, to provide the requisite numbers for missions, whether that's minesweeping, sub-chasing, giant killing, or swatting flies. Those mission profiles are present for all forces, because the moment you have vessels which are capable of one, you need vessels which are capable of the other. The British start out building theirs to hunt submarines and deter people from going down the channel, pretty much. That's it. Act as force modifiers and base protections. That's starting point. The Germans, you could argue, not too dissimilar. And yet, very quickly, they emerge into something else. They emerge into more. They have to. They have to because of the contingencies and exigencies of the time. They have to because of war. Right then. So, what have we got coming up? Well, next week is building the lessons of World War II into new Cold War reality. And I've currently got the patron suggestions live at the moment. People are putting in their patron suggestions, and the vote will start tomorrow. So if you've got suggestions and you're a patron, hang on, the vote will be live when this comes out. The vote will be live when this comes out, so the vote is live. Please go vote. You have till roughly Sunday at 9 o'clock to get the vote in. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed. And by the way, just to explain the patron stuff, patrons suggest topics. I go through topics which I think I can do in the time available. I put into a vote, and then patrons can all vote, and the ones which have the highest votes, the two highest ones, get made. So it's kind of a double lock system, because it means not only do you get to put in your own ideas as a patron, you then get to vote for the ones which succeed. So it's your ideas, and it's people, and it's patrons voting. So patrons voting to decide whose idea, which one they want to hear this month, which has led to some interesting campaigning going on occasionally in the comments of the suggestions in the comments underneath the actual votes occasionally. And occasionally some campaigning going on in the chat of the lives, but we'll leave that to one side. Thank you very much everyone for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. And this is part 4 of the series. Okay. That went wrong. Why did that do that? How much homebrew I got? Yeah, I've got 2.5 bottles. That should be enough. I don't know. And you start eating better. Or at least cooking better for myself. There you go.